The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path. A path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Today's episode is our Judeo-Christian heritage.
Hey everyone, Wade Franson here with Created in the Image of God, episode 261. This is being pre-recorded for airing on July 5th, the 250th, the first day of the 251st year of our nation. And I have, interestingly, somebody whose study of history goes a little bit further back than that. I have in the studio Tremper Longman, who is a leading scholar of Old Testament studies from a Christian perspective. He's a theologian serving as distinguished scholar and emeritus professor of biblical studies at Westmont College, where he spent nearly 2 decades there, 18 years at Westminster Theological Seminary, trained at Ohio Wesleyan in Westminster and Yale, where he obtained a PhD in Old Testament and Ancient Near Eastern Studies. He's written influential commentaries on books like Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, and he was also the senior translator for the wisdom books in the New Living Translation. In addition to that, he focuses on how to use, interpret, understand these ancient writings in a contemporary context. In short, the perfect guest for Created in the Image of God. Welcome to the show, Tremper.
Thanks, Wade. It's great to be with you.
And it's a pleasure. We actually have had and are going to have guests who are in this space. We've covered all kinds of different topics on the show: cosmology with the cosmology editor of Scientific American, the founder of the Freedom from Religion Society, talking about what is truth, media literacy. But I'm on this sort of quest to more fully and completely understand the you might say the foundation of Judeo-Christian society, going way back to the book of Genesis, the Torah, and now the book of Psalms and the wisdom literature. So before we get into the specifics of that, let's talk a little bit about your history. Let's get to know the real you, and understand what was it ultimately that led to this interest on your part. So tell us a little bit about your creation story, your parents, where you were born, circumstances that you grew up in.
Well, I'm glad to do that, but cut me off if I get too long-winded. But so I was born in 1952 in Princeton, New Jersey. My father was a Princeton graduate, but he was out of college and working in Philadelphia, but he wanted to live in Princeton. And I grew up in a loving home. We moved to Columbus, Ohio, where I was interested in mostly sports, eventually not too interested in academics. Played football at a high school where we won the state championship 4 times in a row. And my best friend, Dan Allender, I'll mention him a little bit later, was honorable mention All-American defensive lineman on that team. But the team's relevant because there was a young Baptist minister who started working out in our informal workouts with us. And we thought it was kind of weird. He was probably in his 20s, but in retrospect, I now realize he had noble aims, which is to try to influence our lives toward Christ. And indeed, it was through his influence that I became a Christian senior year in high school. But I still wasn't interested in academics. You know, I was it was during the Jesus Revolution, a little bit of a Jesus freak, after football season was over, I let my hair grow long, and then went off to Ohio Wesleyan University, where I was still playing football. I was too small to play for a big team, but I was playing for a small team. And we started an informal Christian fellowship there with a lot of people that had been becoming Christians. But I started taking classes on the college level, and my college professors kept challenging and questioning my newfound faith. And so then I met my future wife, Alice, who had just come back from a place called L'Abri. She had just become a Christian too, where Francis Schaeffer had a study center, and all the influential people in her life had PhDs in biblical studies. So it was inevitable for me that in order to win the love of my future wife, that I would have to start studying. So I quit football, started studying. My grades went from C to A, and now making a long story a little shorter, I went to Westminster Theological Seminary, where I was influenced by a mentor named Ray Dillard to go into Old Testament. And so I went off to Yale to do my doctorate there, and then was hired to teach at Westminster for 18 years. And as you said, ultimately went to Santa Barbara, taught the last half of my career at Westmont College. So probably the two big moments were becoming a Christian and then deciding to become an academic. I was never really attracted to the pastorate. I don't think it was meant for me, but I was hopeful that God would call me to a more academic work.
Now, the name Ray Dillard seems familiar. Is there a reason I know that name?
Well, I mean, Ray, maybe because Ray and I ultimately wrote an introduction to the Old Testament together that came out in '94 that's still widely used. I updated it. And the sad story is that just before Ray finished his part of that Old Testament introduction, he died at the age of 49. So he never actually saw it. So it's always, I'm actually giving a remote lecture in Cambridge at Tyndale House in a couple of weeks on Old Testament introductions, where I rehearse this history a little bit. But yeah, so and he also wrote.
I'm pretty sure that's where I know the name from, but I'm surprised that I remembered his name and not necessarily your name, which is also unique.
Yeah. Yeah.
So wonderful story. So you know, it's interesting also that whole football background and then getting into academics, you know, those two things often don't seem to be aligned, and it's great to know that side of your story. But why the Old Testament in particular? What was it about those books, and was it happenstance, or was there more to it?
There was more to it, and there were probably a few reasons why. One, Ray was my teacher. I kept thinking of him as old. I was 21 when I was taking his seminary courses. He was 31. He seemed ancient to me, but he was a very charismatic teacher and got a lot of us excited about the Old Testament. And I think I was also attracted to the Old Testament because it's more difficult than the New Testament for Christians, you know, and I recognized that it's culturally more distant. It's coming from before Christ, so it doesn't immediately resonate. A lot of people think it's irrelevant. And I also like ancient languages, and I ended up having to take a lot of ancient languages to do that work. But there was also a practical, Westminster was a very academically oriented school at the time, and everybody in the classes before me were going into New Testament. And I was thinking, there are not going to be any jobs in New Testament. So I went into Old Testament for those reasons mainly. I was just intrigued by it too. I had a lot of questions, still do, you know. And
Well, my audience knows my personal background. I was a part of a sect, you might say, denomination that was kind of like Messianic Judaism in reverse. We were Christians who went back to the Old Testament. The basic premise, as I can sum it up, we didn't necessarily explain it this way, but in hindsight, simplified version is, Jesus was a Jew. He told us to honor and celebrate his death at the Last Supper, right? He didn't tell us ever to honor and celebrate his resurrection. He didn't tell us ever to honor and celebrate his birthday, right? And so we kept the Passover and the other Jewish holy days and the Sabbath. And I spent a lot of time studying into the Old Testament and understanding that linkage and how, Jesus, in that sense, magnified the law and made it honorable rather than, as he says, I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. And if you don't really understand the Old Testament, then you don't really know what it was he was fulfilling and how. And so this has always been a fascinating study to me, and I think it's a gold mine, but it's fraught with dangers because it's thousands of years old, and it was created for a different time and place and people and circumstances.
Yeah, and that's what makes it both intriguing and difficult, and because you have to read the Old Testament in the light of, for Christians, in the light of the New Testament, and see how the New Testament appropriates the Old Testament, and so there are issues of what we might call continuity and discontinuity between the Old and New Testament, and it's a matter of debate among Christians. There's some things we agree are continued or discontinued, like very few, I don't know any Christians who want to do animal sacrifices, for instance. But, a Sabbath is a good example of, is that something that continues or doesn't continue? But it's not as simple as the Old Testament's irrelevant. It's no longer saying anything to us. Nor is it all the Old Testament is relevant in exactly the same way to us today. So there are all kinds of things you got to think through in order to answer the question, how does the Old Testament speak to us today? And then, of course, you have Christ. And so the way I understand that passage you just referred to from Matthew 7 is that the law doesn't pass away until it's been accomplished. And there are some things like the laws concerning animal sacrifice that have been accomplished. So we don't do those things. But also you have Christ saying in Luke 24 that twice in different ways, he says the law and the prophets, or the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, which is a way of referring to the three-part Hebrew canon, all anticipate my coming. And so he's saying that the witness of the Old Testament ultimately points to him. And that then it becomes a question, in what way? I mean, there's some obvious ways that it does, but then there's some, but then there are questions surrounding that as well.
Yep. Well, I think that's a great breaking point for this first segment. We're going to go to a quick commercial break, which is actually a video about you and your work, and giving the audience a quick snapshot, because a picture's worth 1,000 words and a video is then therefore worth 1,000,000 words, right? So when we come back, everyone will be up to speed on who and what you are and what you're doing, and we'll talk then about that work that you've done, diving into some of these books and how you approach them and interpret them for Christians, and teach about them. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more of Tremper Longman on Created in the Image of God.
Christians affirm the Bible as their standard of faith and practice. But what happens when we face complex public issues that the Bible never mentions directly? Questions about immigration, poverty, religious liberty, war, taxation, and the environment shape today's public conversations. Many Christians turn to Scripture seeking guidance. This book helps readers understand how to apply biblical principles to modern policy questions without forcing Scripture to say what it does not say. Author Tremper Longman offers a thoughtful framework for interpreting Scripture in political discussions, exploring both conviction and humility. Because faithful Christians may reach different conclusions, this book encourages careful reflection, meaningful dialogue, and a deeper understanding of God's Word in public life. The Bible and the Ballot. Available now on Amazon.
Welcome back to the July 5th episode of Created in the Image of God. I have to say that because 251 years now going on of American history, and we're now talking about more than 2,500 years of history. Some of those books go back further than that by far. So we have Tremper Longman here, as you know, and let's talk a little bit about that. So when were these books written, largely speaking, as we talk about history?
Sure. And these are matters of scholarly debate, but I'll give you my perspective on it, and then if you want to follow up with questions. But I do think, even though I don't think Moses wrote the entirety of the Torah, I do think...
You mean his death scene, for example?
Yeah, for instance, his death scene. I only know one scholar who argues that he had to have written his death scene, but there are a lot of obvious things in the Torah that had to be written after the time of Moses. And then it's like an iceberg, right? There's some obvious things he didn't write, like the account of his death in Deuteronomy 34. And then there's also in the book of Deuteronomy a very subtle editorial perspective where the editor is talking about events that happen across the river, and he's referring to things that happened in the Transjordan, what today is the Jordan. And so, as we all know, if we've read the book of Deuteronomy, Moses never made it into the Promised Land, so that would be across the river. But that said, I still think, and my more a lot of scholars criticize me and others for this. I do think Moses, who probably lived in the 13th century BC, was wrote some of what is today the Torah. And I think then the writing continues and probably ends around 300 BC, in the end of the Persian, beginning of the Greek. I think a book like...
So what dates do you ascribe then to Moses?
I put Moses in the 13th century BC, not the 15th century BC. And of course, that's a debate among conservative scholars. There are plenty of non-conservative scholars who would question whether Moses is a historical figure.
Right.
But that's because they require an external corroboration, which we don't have. And so, but I think we have a lot of indirect evidence for the Exodus happening, for instance. So, but no explicit mention of the Exodus or even Israel in Egypt. But we wouldn't really expect it either, for reasons that Egyptians didn't typically.
Well, there's one stele, one of those.
Oh,
and I think it's like down near the Valley of the Kings, if I recall, because I've seen it, and I had a guide walk through where there's a reference that seems to be about Israel.
Well, that's probably, you're referring to what's called the Merneptah or Israel stela, which is dated 1208 BC. And it's very important because that is the first mention of Israel outside the Bible, but it's not mentioning Israel in Egypt, it's mentioning Israel in the Promised Land. So, and it has the memorable line, Israel's seed is no more. So Merneptah is bragging that he's completely exterminated the Israelites, but that fits in with the fact that ancient Near Eastern battle reports were always hyperbolic.
Yeah.
And but it is very important because it shows that, and Merneptah is like Ramesses' 13th son, who succeeds him because Ramesses' reign lasts for 60 some years, and a lot of his first sons are already dead. But yeah, so
But Moses isn't mentioned.
But Moses isn't mentioned. But yeah, so I date the Exodus 13th century rather than the 15th century. And part of that is because the archaeology that we know fits better with what the Bible is saying. It doesn't fit perfectly. There are a lot of debates about how to interpret the archaeological remains at what was Jericho, Tel Es Sultan, and so forth. But yeah, so that's when I would date Moses. And I think a book like Ecclesiastes was written in the late Persian, early Greek period, and it's using Solomon more like a character to make a point than actually being the writing of Solomon.
Yeah. So what was it that led you to maybe focus more on the Psalms and this wisdom literature?
Yeah. So I actually kind of hop around the canon a lot in my writing, but I do have a focus on Psalms and wisdom literature. And again, in a very practical sort of reason, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the very exciting and sexy topic of fictional Akkadian autobiographies. So there are about 15 texts written in Akkadian, Akkadian's the language of the Babylonians and Assyrians.
Partially ignorant here because I don't know about the language, but would that vaguely include Job in some way?
No. It's more. So the Akkadian texts are texts that aren't in the Bible. They're most similar as an autobiographical writing to Ecclesiastes, where you have I, the teacher, was, and Ecclesiastes 1:12. So that's kind of an autobiographical connection that got me into the book of Ecclesiastes. And then I was invited to write a commentary on Ecclesiastes and the Song of Songs. And that kind of established me as a wisdom person, and happily so. And then I ended up writing commentaries on Job and doing a lot of writing in the wisdom space, which is just such a wonderful part of the Old Testament canon.
So we talked a little bit about prepping for the show, the idea of pesher, which is the interpretation of these texts, from a Hebrew perspective. And this is because I'm currently studying, and a quick plug for another person coming on in the near future, or maybe already on, I forget the sequencing here, Gary Rensburg, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? And how what was fascinating to me about what I'm learning about the Dead Sea Scrolls was that there's a correlation between how they in Qumran, probably the Essenes, were interpreting some of these writings about a teacher of righteousness, and it's eerily similar to what Jesus was to do, a few decades later after the writing of these scrolls, and the interpretation, from Habakkuk and others around this was just fascinating to me. But your focus is then on how, you have obviously a broad focus, but specific interest in some of the interpretations about Jesus and how in the New Testament this is done, explaining, Jesus from the perspective of the Psalms and the Old Testament writings. Just sort of generally introduce the audience to this idea of interpretation of these writings.
Absolutely. Yeah. So my viewpoint is that the Psalms and the whole Old Testament are written to their original audience in a way that they could understand it and apply it to their lives. And so
it had direct meaning, spiritual power, 1,000+ years before Jesus.
Right. And they're not thinking Jesus, okay?
Right.
They're not reading Psalm 2 and thinking Jesus is coming in the future. They're using Psalm 2, which listeners might want to read as a kind of probably installation of a new Davidic king. And so you have all these kingship psalms in the Old Testament, say, and they're relevant to the kingship in Israel, but the kingship in Judah is deeply flawed, as well as the northern kingdom. And eventually it goes away under God's judgment, 586, when the Babylonians defeat Jerusalem and cart the last king off in chains to Babylon. At that point, I think the readers of the Psalms understood a deeper meaning to the Psalm, a deeper meaning that pointed to the future and to a restitution of kingship. Now, the primary expectation seems to have been of a Messiah who was a human being who would restore, kingship and help free Israel from foreign bondage. But the ultimate fulfillment, as recognized by the New Testament inspired authors, is that the fulfillment was even grander than that, in that they understood that Jesus was the ultimate fulfillment of the expectation of the Psalms. But you see, the Psalms aren't prophecy. They're not prophecies. They're hymns and worship songs, and they were used that way during the Old Testament time period. There was
let me ask a question. So I understand what you just said to mean that there is prophetic writing, and these are not prophetic writing. However, they appear to be prophetic.
Yeah, exactly. And I would even say, and this might be controversial with some, that the prophets themselves are speaking better than they knew, as it's sometimes said, because even they are concerned with their contemporary circumstance. And when they're talking about the future, they don't have a full awareness of how that future is going to be fulfilled. Probably most famously is Isaiah 7:14, where Isaiah is talking to King Ahaz about threats from the north, from the Israelite king Pekah and Assyrian king named Rezin. And he gives Ahaz a sign, and the sign is the Alma, and we could debate whether that should be translated virgin or young woman, will have a child. And by the time she has the child, those two smoking firebrands up in the north will be gone. So you see, even there's a near-term fulfillment to the prophecy. But then, and I talk about this in one of my recent books, The Old Testament as Literature, there are elements within Isaiah 9-11 which also suggest that there might be a further, more dramatic fulfillment of that passage, which of that expectation, which the New Testament picks up on. But
so if I may give a commentary overlay here for the audience, my personal perspective, all this arcane prophecy, and people, there's wild-eyed prophets imagining current events being explained in ancient texts. The flip side of that is if you understand God to be anything close to what God is revealed to be in these holy writings, or even outside of the Bible, what some, around the world and throughout history, people have imagined God to be. This is a being that exists outside of time and space. In that sense, prophecy and prophetic writings is simply history written in advance by a being who exists outside of time and space. And to me, the most hilarious part of this is I have the sun and moon behind me to constantly remind me of God sets the greater and lesser lights in heaven in Genesis to rule the day and rule the night. and the stars also, he says. And then he says he put them there for days, seasons, signs, and times. And if you think the Bible's not a, physics textbook, you're right. But at the same time, there it is kind of like he's describing, space-time and how it works and the movement of bodies that Einstein later came up with. But more importantly, that this unfathomable being has created this entire universe and everything we can see and know as like a gigantic puzzle. And then he reveals all these things through real world events that have meaning at one point in time, but also meaning in the distant future. And then he says, the heavens declare God's glory.
Yeah. That's well put, I think. And it's right. And talking about the biblical text, I would throw in that we have to acknowledge deeper divine intention in the writing that's connected to what you're talking about, that I've said a couple times that the human author didn't have a full understanding of what he was saying. He wasn't just a robot dictating what God is speaking in his ear, but God is using him for an even deeper intention. A good example is in the New Testament. I often think about John the Baptist. John the Baptist, he baptizes one who comes after him, who's greater than he, baptizes Jesus. And then Jesus starts his ministry. He goes out and heals the sick, exorcises demons, etc. And John the Baptist is in prison hearing these reports, and he's thinking, I think I baptized the wrong guy. Because he's saying, where's the, he talked about this one will gather all the chaff and burn it with unquenchable fire. And
right.
So he sends two disciples, Matthew 11, up to Jesus.
Jesus, you're off script. Get back on script here.
Right. So there's an example of John, who is a prophetic figure who doesn't completely understand what he's saying. He's not saying anything wrong, because what I think he doesn't understand is that Jesus is coming as a two-part affair, that he's coming again. But yeah.
No, I agree with you 100% on that. I mean, after all, God said, go thy way, Daniel, the book is not for you. Right. So in some tiny, small way. And then none of his disciples even understood, right? Jesus began to explain, they didn't understand. He said, well, yeah, that's these parables, they're intended to say something that is not understood. Hearing, they will not hear, seeing, they will not see. But to you, it is given to understand. And then he would explain to them what it means, and they still didn't get it. They would ask him again. He would explain again. They still didn't get it. And then they saw him being crucified, and they still didn't get it. Peter denies Christ 3 times because clearly you're off script. You're not, this isn't going the way I anticipated.
Yeah.
So I want to go way broad now for a second. I said I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curveball. This is a little book that has been published by the Royal Falcon Foundation. I was heavily involved in it. Facets of One. And what it does is it asks the question, the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God, the Lord is one. And I asked, is that unique? Is it truly unique? And I thought the answer would be yes. And I started looking at other religions, and I found out, no, the answer is no, it's not unique at all. Something like that exists in everything. And I threw in, things like Buddhism and the Tao. And I talked to this Sri Lankan theologian, actually, who will be on the show, and I don't mean this in any way, but I told him this, and he said, yeah, but Buddhists and the Tao, they don't even believe in God at all. So no, that's not true, right? And I said, but wait a minute, let me read one. So I'm going to read to you what the Tao says. And this is a famous quote from the Tao. And this is my take on that verse, Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God, the Lord is one. Is there something like that in the Tao? And it says, there was something undifferentiated and yet complete, which exists before heaven and earth. I do not know its name. Now, this to me evokes Genesis 1:1, right?
Yeah.
God created heaven and the earth. It was without form and void, and the Spirit of God hovered above the waters. Something that existed that was complete before heaven and earth. I do not know its name. I term it the way. And then you talk about prophecy, right? And then Jesus comes thousands of years later and says, I am the way.
Interesting. Yeah.
So even in those far-flung,
Yeah.
there's the heavens declare God's glory.
Yeah.
It's there, and
Right.
people see it, and mystics and seers and wise men,
Yeah.
they've gotten it in different ways throughout human history and so so give us a couple of examples to conclude this middle segment about interpretations from Psalms, the Song of Songs, right, as interpretations. What are some highlights of your work in terms of, from a Christian vantage point, what's going on in some of these books? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I could go on for hours, because let's take the Song of Songs, for instance. So the Song of Songs during the Middle Ages was interpreted allegorically, where the woman is the church or the individual Christian, and the man is Jesus. And so it becomes this story of the intimate relationship between Jesus and the church. And I think that interpretation is wrong. It's the wrong, it doesn't identify the genre correctly. Allegories are clearly marked. So genre is really important, by the way, in interpretation. You got to figure out what kind of book you're reading. And it's not an allegory. Allegories are like Pilgrim's Progress. It's really obvious. There's a guy named Christian who's traveling to the celestial city. Now, what we have are a collection of love poems, but it's talking about human love. But then outside the book of the Song of Songs, one of the major metaphors of the relationship, and this is what got the allegorists going, is that our relationship to God is like a marriage, and Ephesians 5 talks about that in the New Testament. But so it isn't so much that the allegorists were wrong to have a theological dimension to the interpretation of the song, but they bypassed the important message on human sexuality, and then they pressed into service some of the details of the song in an illegitimate way. Probably one of the most notorious ones is when Hippolytus read Song of Songs 113, which says, "My lover's to me like a sack of myrrh lodged between my breasts." And he said, that's a reference to Jesus Christ. He's the sack of myrrh. And he spans the Old and the New Testaments. And then I go, okay. And that interpretation was repeated all the way through the Middle Ages in commentaries. So they're good ways of, in my opinion, seeing Christ in the Old Testament that preserves the original message of the book. And then there are illegitimate ways that kind of impose a Christian reader on this Christian reading on the song.
So what's the difference between the satchel of myrrh interpretation and some of the ones that we clearly have right from within the New Testament?
Right. Yeah, there are some allegorical interpretations of the Old Testament in the New Testament. I think it's Galatians talks about Hagar and Sarah. Yep. But and there I would say what Paul's doing is not giving us an original interpretation of that passage as much as using that passage as a kind of rift to make a theological point. Or, in Hebrews, when the argument is making a connection between Melchizedek and Jesus, I think it's wrong to say, well, because of Hebrews, Melchizedek in Genesis 14 is Jesus. Again, this raises the whole question of how...
That's an interesting one. I've actually spent a little time with that, and there are problems with that interpretation.
Yes, there are. There are problems with making an identification of Melchizedek as if he is Jesus. He's not Jesus. But but the author of Hebrews is using kind of some of the ambiguity and enigma associated with that to make a point about Jesus, that he is both king and priest. But
yeah. So what about the Psalms and the book that you wrote and their use and their interpretation? Spend a moment on that for us.
Sure. So how to read the Psalms talks about interpretive or Pesher principles that I think are appropriate, which includes things like recognizing what type of psalm it is. There are 150 different psalms. There are a couple that are pretty close, but they're all different. But you can recognize some of them are laments, and some of them are hymns, and some of them are thanksgiving psalms, psalms of confidence. There's a psalm for every season of life. And then when you're sitting down to read a guy named Robert Alder, whom you've probably heard of, a literary scholar, made the point that every culture and every time period tells its stories and writes its poems in different ways, not radically different ways, but you have to ask, how did the Hebrews write poems? And that gets you into conventions like parallelism, the echoing effect within a psalm. So I talk about how we should understand parallelism and imagery and how to understand Hebrew poetry. But, and then, I also talk about the Psalms as kind of a picture gallery of God. It's kind of a generalization, but Psalm 23 tells us God's a shepherd. Psalm 98 says God's a warrior. Psalm 47, God's a king. So it gives us these vivid picture images of who God is. But then at that point, I talk about, well, how do we read the Psalms as Christians, the perspective? And sometimes it's kind of easy to see that, Jesus is the good shepherd. Jesus is the Messiah. He is our anointed king. Jesus is the warrior who's come to defeat the spiritual powers and authority on the cross, and so forth. But those are some of the things I talk about, Wade, in that book.
Thank you so much. I've said frequently, now I'm going to expose my amateur interpretation to a scholar. I'm interested in your take, and feel free to say, yeah, that's not really the way it is. But Psalm 1 and Psalm 2, you mentioned Psalm 2, to me seem to be with broad brushstrokes prophetic, in the sense that the individual person in Psalm 1 and the pure of heart, then you aggregate the lack of that up. When you don't have that, then Psalm 2 is on a broad societal level. The kings of the earth and the peoples of the earth want to cast off his restraint, and it seems to be prophetic, of the kind of situation that we end up reading about in the book of Revelation.
Yeah. So your so-called amateur intuitions, I think, are largely correct. So Psalm 1 and 2, I think, are clearly a couplet, and they're at the beginning of the Psalms intentionally to serve as an introduction to the Psalms. And Psalm 2, you're right, is informative of the situation in the book of Revelation, which I think, my own opinion, and I've written a commentary on Revelation, by the way, that came out a couple of years ago.
I'm gonna have to get that.
It's called Revelation Through Old Testament Eyes. So one of the things to do is talk about the use of the Psalms in the book of Revelation. But my view is the book of Revelation isn't describing something at the discrete final years, but is talking about the situation from the time of the writing up until Christ comes again. In other words, it's looking out at the world and saying, it looks like God's not in control to you. It looks like everything's falling apart into chaos. But let me remind you that God is ultimately in control and he'll have the final victory. So your response should be to just persist in your faith and understand that God will right everything wrong eventually. So
Awesome. I think that's a great stopping point for this. We're going to go to a quick break. When we come back, we're going to ask, where are you growing next? And the question of applying all this to modern life and the chaos we see around us. Don't go anywhere. We're going to come back and wrap up with Tremper Longman here.
In a world where religions often talk past each other, what if we just sat down and listened? Facets of One is a simple devotional, bringing together scripture from the world's faiths, centered on one truth: God is one. From the Bible to the Quran, from Krishna to Christ, each voice speaks in turn, without argument, without division. You don't have to agree on everything. Just be willing to pray, to listen, and to come together. If you're longing for something deeper than noise and division, this is a different kind of conversation. Facets of One. Many voices, one God. Will you start a circle?
Welcome back to the wrap-up segment here for Tremper Longman on Creating the Image of God. So we've been talking a lot about Old Testament scholarship, the writings you've done, interpretation, and we didn't really talk about our modern world and interpretation today. What can you share with our audience about the use of all of these writings? And we just even talked about the book of Revelation, not New Testament, but from your perspective, using the law of the prophets and the writings to help understand even the book of Revelation. What does all of this mean for people alive today at this juncture in history?
Well, in terms of Revelation and its predecessor, Daniel, which has the same message essentially, which is different than a prophetic message like a Jeremiah prophetic message. It's Jeremiah is calling us to repentance, which is still something that's relevant for Christians today. But Daniel and Revelation are trying to assure Christians who are afraid, fearful, and maybe even angry. And that might describe a lot of Christians today. And it's saying, don't be fearful, don't be angry. Even though it seems like the world's spinning out of control, I'm in control and I'll have the final victory. So you don't have to. So I think those books speak to us in that way. But, how the Old Testament as a whole speaks to us today will take us way too long to explain. I mean, the Psalms are...
Well, we'll have to have you come back then to unpack that if you're willing.
Yeah, no, I'd be more than willing. But I'll just briefly mention the Psalms since we've been talking about the Psalms. As John Calvin said, they're a mirror of our soul. They help us understand what's going on inside of us and help us give us words to speak to God when we are struggling or when we're joyful or whatever. And so, I'd love to come back on and talk more about that. I'm editing a commentary series now called the Story of God Commentary Series, which every volume, first of all, looks at the text in its original setting, but then talks about how is it fulfilled in Christ and what's its continuing contemporary significance for us today.
Wonderful. So where's a good starting point, books that are out, and when do you think that one will be out? Where can people engage with your work?
Well, yeah, I'm afraid I don't have a website. I used to, but I got too lazy keeping it up. So just Google me on Amazon.com or ChristianBooks.com. You'll see my various books there.
It's Tremper Longman III then in that instance.
Yeah, well, my son and my father and grandfather weren't authors, so I think if you just do Tremper Longman, but yeah. So that series is actually about 25 different volumes. I did the Genesis commentary, which is already out, and about 3/4 of them are already out. And then But my own work, I'll just quickly say, I talked earlier about an Old Testament introduction. I'm doing another one with two other scholars, Sandy Richter and Nancy Erickson. That'll be the counterpart to Tom Wright and Mike Bird, N.T. Wright, Mike Bird's New Testament introduction. Then I'm about to finish the second volume of a trilogy. I did the Old Testament as literature. I'm about to finish the Old Testament as history, and then the Old Testament as theology. And then finally, I'm doing a 4-book. The 3-book and the 4-book are both for Baker, the introductions for Zondervan, called Navigating Tough Texts of the Old Testament. And the first one's coming out in September. That'll look at 90 tough texts in the Torah, and then historical books, wisdom books, prophetic books. So
just a wealth of research, scholarship, and explanation, and maybe some interpretation around all of these things that people can access. So thank you so much for being on the show. This has been enlightening, educational, and very enjoyable. What final words do you have for our audience today?
Well, I encourage everybody to read the Old Testament and to remember that read the Bible in general, but that there's a wealth of wisdom and insight, and I would argue divine revelation in those books.
Well, and the title of this show goes way back, Created in the Image of God. So thank you for being here. Everyone else, stay tuned for the sneak peek of the upcoming shows for next week. And remember that you are created in the image of God, and God loves his creation. We'll see you next week.
Next week on Created in the Image of God. Sunday, July 12th at 7 a.m. U.S. Central Time, host Wade Franson interviews Graham Tomlin, theologian, author, and former Bishop of Kensington. He reflects on how Christians can engage culture with wisdom, conviction, and grace, and what it means to be a faithful witness in public life. From theology and mission to helping the church speak clearly and compassionately in a changing world. And then on Tuesday, July 14th at 8 p.m. Central Time, host Wade Franson interviews Vinoth Ramachandra, theologian, author, and international lecturer. He explores the intersection of faith, justice, and global culture, and challenges Christians to think beyond familiar assumptions and perspectives. From politics and suffering to a deeper vision of hope, discipleship, and engagement with the world. Join us live this week, Tuesday and Sunday.